Oh, okay. Let me share this really quick. So I'm going to cover the basics of pen testing and what you'll need of it for the CyberForce competition, right? As a red team volunteer. Okay, this is good. Okay. And quick check, are you able to see my screen with a table of contents here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I recently sent this out, right? So basically these are rules for that were sent to the blue team, and it explains how we're going to do red team this year. So for those who volunteered last year, we really changed it up last year. We used this assume breach model with a playbook and with a score chat, right? So we're still doing that, and the VM that we're doing that on is Windows 2016, and then I think in the latter half, so the competition day is about 8 hours long. In the latter half of the day, we're also going to be doing real-time injections into the other VMs as well. And so that counts as sort of this assume breach playbook interacting with a score chat that we did last year. What we're doing a little bit differently, and it's kind of a throwback from earlier years of the CyberForce competition. So this used to be how the CyberForce competition was done for about the first three years of the competition, where basically the red team was not giving any information, and you basically just had to use a black box methodology of pen testing, right? And there are pros and cons to this, and I feel like how we're sort of trying to make the most out of this, right, is that it's going to be no information to the red teamers volunteers for the first 3 hours. So for the first 3 hours, for all these other VMs that you're going to have to find out in the environment, right, you're going to have to do very typical pen testing activity, which I'm going to be reviewing for the first 3 hours. And then after that, the organizers, they're going to start feeding you information like, hey, these are the vulnerabilities that we know are in the virtual machine, right? And then you can sort of use that and going at an appropriate pace, and also using the score chat to interact with the blue team to sort of, hey, where are you at? Do you see this? Do you see that? How is it going, right? So it's not very typical of other way that cyber defensive competitions go about. And in the earlier versions of cyber defensive competitions, you have this issue where what I call the gaming issue, right? So basically the gaming issue is where, because this is a very time constrained environment and you're just doing a small set of virtual machines, and the blue team knows you're coming, so they're going to do everything in their power to keep out the red team, and then the red team is going to do everything in their power to make it miserable for the blue team, right? And then, if you think about that, is that like the best way of running the competition? It's one way, there's benefits of running it that way, but we feel that if we sort of focus on sort of extracting the educational value and sort of tracking, like, hey, is the blue team really understanding all of these important cybersecurity concepts and defensive and attack information, right? So we're much more interested in that aspect of the competition, and with our score chat and how we go about doing the assumed breach and this external pet testing, it's going to reflect that, right? So this is on our repo, so feel free to read that, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask in our Discord. But with that, for people who don't have a lot of pen testing experience, right, now I'm going to just give a really quick overview about what aspect of pen testing you need to know in order to do this. And also, there's a huge overlap between pen testing and red teaming. Everyone has their own definition of that, but my quick definition is pen testing, that is activities that is more tailored along the lines of discovering and proving vulnerabilities within a system or environment. So within pen testing, you're not testing the blue team. You're testing the software, the environment, the system configurations, right? And you're uncovering and proving those vulnerabilities. That is the definition of pen testing we're using here. Red teaming, what's the definition of red team? Red teaming is an exercise where you are exercising or sparring with a blue team, right? So when we bring up red teaming activities, then we're thinking about, hey, there's a blue teaming there. So, what does that mean, right? So if you're talking about pen testing, if you're saying, hey, I'm trying to be stealthy, I'm trying to hide, that's not pen testing, that's red teaming. If you're trying to do hiding type stuff or stuff to avoid the blue team or to, get one up on the blue team, that is red teaming. When you're just doing what Dave showed earlier about, hey, I have burp sweep running, right? I'm using burp sweep, I'm testing this, I'm testing that. That is pen testing. And then funny enough, it's kind of weird because we're doing pen testing in this blue teaming exercise, right? This red teaming, blue teaming exercise. So, for those people who are familiar with environments such as, Hack the Box, right? Or if you do bug bounties on websites, for those environments, you're trying to find vulnerabilities and you're using pen testing techniques. And when you're doing that, you're running your burp suite. You don't have a blue team or defender who's like, oh, look, I see what you're doing. I'm going to kill your connection. I'm going to block your IP address. That's not what you're doing there, right? But we're in this weird space where, okay, I can see Dave now, right? He's trying to run his burp suite, and then the blue team is like, okay, I'm just going to turn off my port 80 now, and then you're like, whoa, wait a minute, right? So according to prior rules of these cyber defensive competitions, you have that kind of activity, but the way that we're doing it this year, right? Hopefully we'll avoid some of that with the approach where we're taking. So that's some comments about definitions of pen testing versus red teaming, how you potentially could see it previously in CyberForce competition, and how it's probably going to look like this year. And with that, I'm going to transition about a really quick intro in terms of what you need to know for pen testing, right? So, okay, this is a really good guide. So I found some really good resources. So there are some of these guides to prepare you for the offensive security, PWK class, and the OSCP. And so basically, a lot of that material is what you'll need for the pen testing portion, right? So if you sort of get really good at the activities that I identify, you're going to be really well prepared for the pen testing portion. And so again, let's talk about the details, because people just sort of mix in so many different activities. For instance, writing binary exploits, right? That does not fit in usually in traditional pen testing, right? And like a lot of the red teaming activities, like running your own like C2 environment, that's a red teaming thing. That's not a pen testing thing, right? So a lot of these other activities, unfortunately, they just all just get combined, and it gets really confusing about, hey, for pen testing, what do you actually have to know and what do you actually have to use, right? So those things I just mentioned, right, put them aside. Those are the things that we might use for our assumed breach, advanced adversary emulation part. For the pen testing, what you'll need is the following, and I'll go through it, right? So right, Linux and Bash, definitely. That's why we told you to get your own VM environment, right? Get your own VM environment, get that going. Passive recon, as defined by PWK, we're not going to really do that. What it's talking about there is like, you go on LinkedIn, right? You go on someone's Facebook, right? That's what they're talking about, their passive recon. And for what we're doing for the pen testing stuff, we're not going to really doing that. Active recon is going to be huge. And under active recon, I would also say enumeration, right? Enumeration. I feel like at least 70% is enumeration. That's sort of the meat and potatoes of pen testing. So really high level, right? So what are the big categories of pen testing? Basically, you're doing enumeration to find known vulnerabilities and known security misconfigurations. Then there's also this category of web vulnerabilities, and I would categorize that as its own animal because it's such a big field, right? So web vulnerabilities, I would put that as its own category. But in general, for all the other networking services, I would in general say it is enumeration, finding out vulnerable software versions, right, and proving that they're vulnerable, and also security misconfigurations. So in terms of the big bins of penetration testing, that's it. That's basically all it boils down to. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of meat and potatoes of how you actually do a good job of doing, executing those buckets, right? And so that's what I'm going to be covering with some of these other categories, right? But at very high level, that's all it is. So when someone is telling you about, hey, I'm doing this very advanced stuff to evade Windows Defender, I would push that more into the red teaming side. Like for some exploitation proofs, you might have to do it for pen testing, but I definitely feel like that's more once you're trying to evade the latest and greatest EDRs and sort of AVs. I would push that more into like a thing that red teamers need to be concerned about, right? But again, that's where the line gets kind of blurry between those two activities. So active recon is big. Buffer overflows, we don't have to worry about that. But if I have volunteers that are good with that, I have some tasking that you can help me with if you're like have an expertise there. Using public exploits potentially, right? Potentially. This one is big. So I told you enumeration is a big part of pen testing. The other is just very logistical stuff. And one of the big categories there is just the ability of transferring files back and forth, right? A lot of this plumbing type stuff, you're going to have to be really good at in order to actually prove that the vulnerability is exploitable, right? And so stuff like file transfer is big there. Privilege escalation, yes, in terms of enumerating, finding those paths of privilege escalation. Client-side attacks. This one I would leave as a thought experiment in terms of the information you have already been exposed to our repo, what you're understanding if you've competed previously, and what you know about the architecture and how the different teams work for the CyberForce competition. Think about like, okay, do we have client-side attacks, right? Yes or no, and why? We definitely have web application attacks. So the type of stuff that Dave has showed in his demo, that's definitely there. We do have password attacks, but the thing about password attacks here is that we'll do sort of kind of the minimum, I would say. It was like, okay, we'll do some password type attacks to show like, hey, there's no default type stuff, right? So we'll do some of that, but don't get too crazy with this. So this is where these kind of competitions differ drastically from the real world. So in the real world environments, you have thousands of machines, you have all these different people with all these different kind of configurations, right? So there's a lot of insecurities in real world environments. That's why password attacks are so successful in the real world. And that's why pen testers and red teamers rely on them heavily because they work so well. But in a cyber defensive competition, a security competitions, this is one of the first things, like if they're just complete beginners, blue teamers, you might get a little bit about this, but if they get any like a little bit of skill for these competitions, one of the first things they do is they're going to change passwords. They're going to create complex passwords, right? So in the real world, you would invest a lot here, cracking passwords, crazy long lists that you can throw at a machine for weeks. But for the CyberForce competition, we only have 8 hours, and you spend 6 of those hours on password attacks. It's like there's way more important stuff you should be focusing on than the password attacks, right? But again, we could do the minimum stuff that we need there, right? And again, for the logistics, port redirection and tunneling is important. And also, we're going to rely quite a bit on Metasploit, so knowing how that works is important. AV, I don't think we're going to focus on that too much for the pen testing part of our activities. So that's in a nutshell in terms of, if you're like, hey, for the pen testing, what do I focus on? What I sort of explained, that's what you should focus on. And again, right, the way I kind of explain it, it doesn't seem that complex. It's just a lot of practice. You're going to have to do a lot of practice, and that's where I'm going to get to the next reference, right? So I really love this diagram, right? So this shows you about in our community what kind of happens, right? And this is not just noob hackers. I feel like it's just pen testers, period, where to get really good at cybersecurity, there's a foundation you have to build in operating systems, networking, system administration, programming, right? A lot of these foundational topics that if you sort of know really well, your ability in penetration testing and red teaming gets skyrockets. But what happens is because we have such powerful tools, and a lot of our training is more about just really quickly ramping up beginners so they can do something right for their job. And unfortunately, I feel like in a lot of cases, a lot of people in our industry, they bypass the basics, and then they could do some stuff with Metasploit, right, with Cobalt Strike and some of these other very powerful tools. But then when they run into situations like I showed in my demo earlier, because they don't have the foundations, they're not able to troubleshoot it. And so for us here, right, for our bootcamp, we're really emphasizing like, okay, we're going to teach you some of these, cookbook style, cut and paste what you need, and this is a recipe of how to do A, B, and C, right? We'll give you that, but then we also really want you to invest in the time to build your foundations. So when you run into these difficult to analyze, like whether it's vulnerable or not, you'll have that foundation to be able to make that call. So yeah, I really like that diagram. And the last thing, exactly, yeah, Dave says, you get how to use the tool. Yeah, so Dave makes comments, people, they will learn how, okay, this is how you use a tool, this is arguments you put, you can use it, but what's happening under the hood, right? What's happening under on the Ethernet wire, right? That's what really matters, and that's a hard part, and that's where we're trying to get you better at. And again, right, so in terms of topics that you will need to know in the pen testing, right? So the bid category, I told you 70% of pen testing is enumeration. So enumeration, but then okay, what are you enumerating, right? You got to figure out what's the difference between TCP and UDP, right? And then you're going to be enumerating all the very common services. This isn't a comprehensive list, but this is just a good starting list right here, right? DNS, HTTP, MySQL, SSH, SNMP, SMTP, SMB, FTP. If you don't know what it is, right, find out. And then you have your VMs, try to get these services working. And then after you get this working, run your tools against it. And then once you run your tools against it, try to create vulnerable configurations with all these services, and then run your tools against it, right? And if you do that, you're going to be in a really good place in terms of preparation for the competition. And these are other kinds of information that's going to carry you a long way for building a good foundation for red teaming, right? Knowing basic system admin information, networking information, right? User information, file permissions, right? And some of this, and also very, very common tools. So yeah, very good. So that is what I had in terms of information about this is like a high level overview of pen testing. Please, a lot of this information we already have on our Get repo, right? We have all the homework assignments. We're gonna slowly add more. And if you feel that you're comfortable helping us contribute, add stuff to our Get repo as well, please volunteer. But this is the only caveat I would give you, right? There's so much material in the world of red teaming and pen testing. And if you just give a mountain of information to our beginners, they're going to get overwhelmed and they're just going to get shell shocked and they don't know, what do I do? There's just so much. So what we want to do is just give them the pieces that they need and find out where they're at and just slowly build them up, right? It's like, okay, you don't know this basics of how do you configure FTP or something like that. Start there, right? And so do you know how user permission works in Linux and Windows? Like, okay, learn that and then slowly build on that, right? And everyone's different. And we're all willing to help here in our bootcamp. So please share your questions if you run into issues, or if you're making good progress, please share, because you might not think it. You say you got say you got an exploit working for SSH, right? You're like, oh, this is great, and then please share, and for you think it's too basic or beginnerish. I think you should still share it, because there are other people that might not know that, right? And then once they see that from you, they could learn from you, right? So yeah, highly encourage people to continue contributing. And already I'm seeing a lot of that in our bootcamp Discord channel. So that makes me really happy. And yeah, awesome. With that, unless there's any questions, I'm going to end this portion of the agenda.